It's Tuesday, and what is potentially the most hyped card of the season just got dropped, which means it is the right time to look ahead and talk about what's coming next season so people are able to properly evaluate Firehair in the context of what their resources might be used on in the future. That's right, let's look ahead to the what if season and all of the cards releasing next month. As always, these are Datamines. Thanks to Marvel Snap Zone and Snap.fan for providing me with these Datamines via their websites. The first card we're going to talk about is Captain Carter. Captain Carter is a Season Pass card, the Season Pass card for this season, and I think in what seems like a departure from the previous Season Pass cards that we've had, this is not a 2-drop staple, nor is it a generically good 4-drop. This is instead an archetype specific 4-drop, which is a much more difficult sort of card to actually make. Captain Carter is a 4/3 with an ability that gives her power to the cards in the back row at her location. That is to say, in the 3rd and 4th slots at a location, that is the back row. So what she is in a full location is a 4/9 if there's no buffs being applied. But she'll also multiply buffs being applied effectively. If you put her next to a Captain America, for example, she will get 2 additional power and give that 2 additional power to the cards in the back row. In other words, I think this is a card that is sort of difficult to change without drastically changing it. You obviously can't make it a 3 cost if you want to make it stronger, because that makes it a Silver Surfer card, which is just sort of straight up obviously not a good thing to do. If you give it an extra point of power, it's basically a 4/12 if you fill a location, which puts it into that Galacta range with even more upside. So this is basically the only plausible stat line I can see that actually makes this card a releasable card. And the question I have is whether or not that means that's a good thing or a bad thing. Because on the one hand, if it releases strong and they have to nerf it, going from 4/3 to say 4/2 is a really big deal, and it is kind of the only plausible nerf. If it releases weak and they have to buff it, then it ends up going to 4/4, and that feels way too strong. So the real thing I'm thinking about with this card is that I don't think there's a lot of room for error when it comes to making the purchase decision. I do think it's likely that this ends up a much more archetype-specific card than the past few Season Passes we've had, but it's not like archetype-specific Season Passes haven't been the best deck before. In fact, before this current run of Sam Wilson, Iron Patriot, and of course Galacta, there were multiple archetype-specific cards like Anti-Venom or Agent Venom, I'll get it right eventually, and Surtur that were incredibly used only in their own decks, but they were so strong that they made their own decks metagame defining. I do think she's a little bit below those, but she is still a powerful card, and we are in a metagame where they have been leaning into ongoing effects, and it looks like they're going to continue leaning into ongoing effects, so I do think that this is the kind of card that can see more play than people think. When I look at this card, I effectively see a 4-cost Iron Man in the sense that, like, I'm going to put this in a lane, and then I'm probably not going to worry about the lane much anymore. I've just got to get like nominal bodies in there, like move a Captain America shield in there or something along those lines, right? Like this goes in a lane and I'm probably going to win it if it goes next to a Captain America, right? Like that kind of stuff is just like, that's probably happening. It at least makes the lane extremely hard to contest because what are you going to do? Contest against someone who's getting like basically a Nidavelir's worth of power on their back row cards? Like that is sort of what I think about when I think of this card. But it does require you to be able to fill up those lanes, which without Sam Wilson, these decks are not very good at, typically ongoing decks. Which it also, if you're going to play the other ongoing deck, which is good at filling up lanes, that's the Doom 2099 deck, and she competes directly with him on cost. And so while I can see a world where like you're doing like Zabu 2099 and this in that shell, I do think that like maybe she's going to end up getting priced out of that with the advent of the fact that there are so many other elite 4-drops in this game. Exciting card, but I would expect it to, unless it really breaks through in a deck built around it, see less meta play than our last few Season Passes have. First up in the spotlight caches is Goliath. Goliath is a 2/1 that gets +1 power with an ongoing ability for every other ongoing card you have in play. There's a couple of natural synergies here. The first is that this is a card that in any deck that is currently playing Dazzler and is an ongoing deck is likely going to be better than that. The second is, Doombots 2099 have an ongoing ability. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? That's effectively adding that power back that they just lost to this deck as long as they have this card on the board. And the third is, I think this is just a better card than Dazzler in your average curve out sort of ongoing deck, like the Moonstone decks that are looking to double up Iron Men and things like that. Doubling up this is also kind of going to be a relevant thing. If you get 5 to 6 ongoings on the board, doubling that up is going to be really, really relevant. And so this is a card that I think is likely to end up a staple in its archetype, but not necessarily do much beyond that. Where what I mean by that is this is not a very splashable card in a meaningful way. You are going to really want Sam Wilson for this because he makes a thing that has an ongoing that's effectively starting this guy a power up. You are going to want to play him in decks where he has specific synergy with every other ongoing deck. So the Moonstone Spectrum deck, the Doom 2099 ongoing deck, those are the decks that are going to play him. And I don't really think that he's going to be generic good too in the way that things like Iron Patriot or Sam Wilson have been, but much more like the toned down version of a Surtur for ongoing. That's sort of the image I have in my head here. Of course, by toned down version of a Surtur, there's kind of a lot of wiggle room there. Really toned down Surtur is sort of where I would put him at. I think this is going to be a very good card if you plan on playing those decks. And if you do not plan on playing ongoing hyper synergy decks, I am not sure that you will want to invest in this card. However, it does seem like it absolutely will have a home in those decks that are actually invested in playing a bunch of ongoings and saying, you can't Enchantress me everywhere. I think Kahori might be a contender for one of the stronger cards in this set that is generally not being regarded as such. That is a 4/6 that effectively has half of Devil Dinosaur's text on it. It scales based on the cards you have in hand when you play it, so it's going to be maybe a 4/12 if you have 6 cards in hand when you play it. But, and this is really crucial, unlike Devil Dinosaur, it doesn't require you to keep those cards in hand. There's a lot of decks right now where the goal is build up cards in hand that are cheap that you are going to expend on the final turn of the game. This goes perfectly in stuff like that. Iron Patriot, immense synergy here. This is the kind of thing where you're I'm building up stuff in hand. I'm building up stuff in hand. My final turn's going to be really explosive. Devil Dinosaur doesn't work with that because you take points away from him for every card you play. Kahori does work with that, and that means that you're going to be playing her as just a very uniquely powerful card. There is another interaction here. What if we just play her after playing a Sebastian Shaw? Each one of those procs is +3. That seems like a very fun and good thing to do. Although I do think that perhaps the consistency loss will be meaningful in the context of Silver Surfer. There's some really interesting stuff that this card does. This is the closest to a generic value card in the entire set here. And I think a lot of that is because some of the generic value 2s, Kate Bishop, and of course Iron Patriot, tend to go with what this card is already doing. There's also some additional potential upside here when we talk about the sort of hybridized versions of V-Hand decks that, again, when you're doing something this card is already wanting you to do, that is putting cards into your hand, it feels like she's just going to be a pretty damn good card to put in your deck. The question, I think, what we're going to have is this good enough to compete with Gwenpool and to compete with Galacta in Agamotto shells? And I think it's probably not competing with Galacta, and maybe it won't compete with Gwenpool, but I will say, if you Images of Icon this, and you have any reasonable amount of cards in your hand, that is probably going to be better than a Gwenpool because the buffs are actually going to be on the board, whereas a lot of the time with Gwenpool, they go on the things that you might not actually be playing. In other words, I think this card has a chance to take over a spot in one of the best decks in the game and directly outcompete a card that is already very powerful. I think that that's the sort of thing that I'd be expecting from Kahori. I expect her to have a very high floor and a very high ceiling, frankly. I can see her at worst being like pretty good in a bunch of tier 2 decks, and at best, I can see her being a card that makes it into some of the best decks in the game, frankly. I agonized over how to talk about this guy. It's very difficult to talk about him without all the context, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through all the context. Infinity Ultron is a 5/6. He adds 2 Ultron Infinity Stones to your hand with his On Reveal ability. Now, what I'm going to do is talk about each of the Ultron Infinity Stones individually and whether or not they're good cards based on that. And then we're going to talk about Ultron as a whole and what sense he makes in various decks. Ultron Space Stone is a 3/4 with a pseudo-Juggernaut type effect, where it moves the lowest power card from the location it's played on to Infinity Ultron's location. We know from stuff like Juggernaut that this can be really, really powerful, especially if you don't have priority and they're only really playing one card and then it's moving whatever you need it to, but it is a little bit finicky. This obviously is not as good as Juggernaut, and the fact that you're only getting 2 of these stones means that it's hard to count on getting something like this, where the appeal of Juggernaut is that he is very dependable. I do think that it's interesting that it moves to Infinity Ultron's location, because there is another stone that manages to buff Infinity Ultron. So the theory here is you buff Infinity Ultron, move something to his location, and then you effectively have just like removed that thing from mattering because you're winning the Infinity Ultron location. It's interesting, and I also like that it's at 3/4 stats, and I do appreciate that they chose to make these stones not locked into like the 1/1 paradigm of Thanos stones. These are all like, they range from 3/1 to 3/4, and I think that's good because it gives them room to buff and nerf the stones as necessary if they want to improve Infinity Ultron's performance or decrease Infinity Ultron's performance. Ultron Reality Stone is a 3/1 that creates a drone, presumably the same 1/2 drone from normal Ultron, and then sets its power equal to Infinity Ultron's. Again, this is effectively like, when you look at it, that is a 3/7. Is that worth doing necessarily? Maybe not. But when you Quinjet it, it's a 2/7, and then suddenly it really starts being worth doing. And then you start thinking about what this card is actually going to be with Quinjet. Like, if you're Quinjetting into these stones, you are suddenly getting much, much, much above rate. If you're Sarahing or even just Bolts of Balthacking, I think those are less likely because Infinity Ultron does cost 5. But like, just having a Quinjet on the board, these are suddenly pretty reasonable cards. And I think this one at 2/7 is like, that is pretty exciting and cool. Where at 3/7, it's like, you know. Of course, if you are able to double Infinity Ultron's power, this becomes 3/13, and that's definitely worth doing. Ultron Time Stone just puts a card from your hand here. That is going to be a very contextual thing, because there's probably going to be a lot of cards in your hand if you're playing a deck like this, especially if, as I think, you're going to be Quinjetting a decent amount of the time, which means you're going to be playing those cards that put cards in hand. So I think this one's actually going to look very strong, but underperform a decent amount of the time. The high rolls on this are going to be as good as it gets, though. Like, this is basically like a small Eson for 3. Ultron Mind Stone is a 3 energy Wong, which is really, really interesting, but also probably a lot harder to do than you'd think. So Wong's utility is that you could play it early, right? Like, you're not playing this anytime before turn 6 most of the time because Ultron is a 5-cost card. So what are you doing with it? Well, you can double up on some of the other effects that you have here, like doubling up on doubling Ultron's power or doubling up on making drones or whatever. That's not nothing, but it is a pretty significant investment. So you're gonna need other stuff to do on that final turn. Maybe you can play this in a Silver Surfer deck. I think I'll try it, but I don't necessarily expect it to work. This is the kind of thing where it's like, if you have a way to lock up a lane on like turn 4, then suddenly just Ultron stoning your way to winning another lane feels a lot more plausible to me. But I'm not really sure we have that. Power Stone, of course, doubles Infinity Ultron's power on reveal, and that is a really strong thing to do. Like, you have this ability to, like, take Ultron to 24 power with Mind and Power Stone. You have the ability to double Ultron's power and then copy it with the stone that makes the drone and sets it to Ultron's power. There's a bunch of weird crap that you can do, but I think the best of the things you can do almost always revolve around the Power Stone, where it's this plus one of the things that effectively doubles it, either the one that makes the drone or the one that actually literally doubles it. Like, those are the strong things it feels like to do with this card, and Power Stone is the linchpin of those strategies. Of these stones, I think this is not necessarily the strongest, but the one that lets you do the most and increases your range the most. In a cute nod to original Ultron, the Soul Stone from Infinity Ultron says, for each of your full locations, give a unit their +2 power at 3/3 rate if you actually have all of your locations full. This is like a pretty reasonable card and ends up looking a lot like Speed or something like that in terms of total power output, but spread across 3 locations. A 3/9 is nothing to sneeze at. It's a very solid thing to get. And I think that this is like one of the more middling versions of the stones, but it'll be like a quiet performer if you're able to actually make it happen. So, the whole package, there's definitely some spikes in here in terms of power. Like, only getting 2 stones means you're probably not getting the Power Stone a lot, and some of these stones I don't think play well with whatever else it is you were doing. But the upside is definitely here. It's just going to be a question of whether or not it's worth risking the downside of like getting these cards and playing a 5/6. I think this card is like 1 or 2 points of power short of being in basically every deck. I think if they wanted to make sure it was like going to be much better, they could make it a 5/7. But I think that if they did that, they'd be running the risk of a lot of Infinity Ultron decks running around. I expect this card to have a similar reception to Agamotto, where a lot of people are like, wow, this is super busted on day one. And then they sort of realize that like it's good, but it's not like, whoa, oh my God. I expect an Agamotto type reaction. I expect an Isan type reaction. Like, this is the kind of card that I think people tend to overrate when they play it the first time, but I do think that there is legitimate power here, and I don't want to discount it. Like, it's the same way with Agamotto. Like, is he overrated? Yes. Is he bad? Absolutely not. He's very good still. And I think that on the whole, if anything holds this card back, it is its stat line and the fact that you are just a little bit unlikely to get to the really good combinations of stones. I like that they tried to give a lot of the stones hooks with each other, but I do think that the Power Stone and its hooks are the ones that really stand out to me in terms of what it's actually able to put onto the board. Strange Supreme. This is a 2/2 and one of the weirdest cards I've ever seen. It gets +2 power whenever it merges with something, and at the end of the turn, it merges a created card with it. And I think that's just, like, that is really fascinating. Like, do you want to do that? Do you want to take your 1/6 demon and make it a Shang-Chi-able target? Do you want to play a Squirrel Girl deck where you're just eating your squirrels for 4 power, for 3 power every time? Is that good? Are you interested in that? What I can tell you is that I expect this guy to reach very large numbers. If you're willing to go out of your way and like play the Squirrel Girl Mysterio deck and just give him like 2 or 3 power every turn, he's going to be really big. You're going to be using those cards to play Mockingbirds, and in the case of Mysterio, Sasquatches. There's power in that shell. It hasn't been super metagame relevant for a while, but there has always been a legitimate way to build that deck, and I do think that he does go in that, and he does make it better, but he's so hyper-specific that I'm not sure if he's going to make it happen. However, I expect to see this guy get into the double digits often. I expect double-digit numbers out of this card. I expect that he helps alleviate some of the downside of being a Squirrel Girl Mysterio deck in the sense that it clogs you. I expect that to be honestly pretty good. This is a card that I look at and I'm like, I have hope for this card reviving an archetype on its own. And I think, unfortunately, with Marvel Snap's release system, that's how good cards have to be if their home is gonna be one of those archetypes. Because if this card isn't good enough to make me look at it and say, I think this can bring a whole deck back by himself, he ends up being like Thaddeus Ross or whatever, where it's like, if it is not good enough to be that, it ends up being a complementary piece. So this is probably the card that is the highest delta in terms of whether or not it's going to be worth it to buy. Because if he is good enough to bring that deck back, he is going to be absolutely worth it. If he's not good enough to bring that deck back, there's no point buying him because that's the only thing he goes in. So he could be anywhere from Thaddeus Ross to Agent Venom, basically. Like, this is a card who could range in power depending on metagame context and what he's able to accomplish and how good he actually is. It's the hardest card to predict in this season, and this season has Infinity Ultron in it. Finally, Hydra Stomper, a 3/2 with an ongoing ability that gives it +1 power for each time your cards moved this game. I don't want to be like, this is only for this, but like, this is a Heimdall card. This is a card that gets like +7 or whatever off of a Heimdall. This is a card for like putting Heimdall in your mid-range decks. That's what it's telling you to do. Like, put this in your mid-range deck, put Heimdall in your mid-range deck, and just start juking people and gaining power. That probably works. Like, it's a card for surprise Heimdall gamers, and that's a real thing. I do think that on the whole, it's probably the least exciting card in the month, but something probably has to be. And while this is a card that I think might be a little bit better suited for Series 4 than anything else, it's still an exciting and unique addition to what is not necessarily an archetype just yet, but could be in the future. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching that video. Check back with me tomorrow. We'll have Firehair decks for you. But before you go out there and spend on Firehair, do keep in mind that you are directly spending something that is in competition with the cards we just talked about. As always, I've been KMBest, you've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.